Hello, everybody, and welcome to another spectacular episode of Detailed Diatribes here on Overly Sarcastic Productions. I am Blue, and today I'm joined by Red.
Yo, it's me.
And we're going to be talking about a topic that I've addressed over the course of many live streams, probably going back years at this point. But now I've done my homework. I've finally put everything together into one beautifully distilled 48-slide PowerPoint.
48?
And we're going to talk...
I think I tapped out at like 30 for the Dragon Ball one.
Yeah, well, some of them are fast. It's about architecture. The reason we're here is that I have a lot of thoughts about history and architecture and games, and I'm putting that together to ask the question of how historical is the Assassin's Creed series really?
Oh, spicy.
Because it's like, okay, it's a game, it's set in history, but like how much is in real? Question mark? You know?
Yeah, very eloquently phrased, but yeah, the Assassin's Creed games are rather notorious for framing themselves as historical, and then being full of, hot nonsense, to put it gently. So it's
we'll see the progression.
Right, but of course it's like, a lot of that is, it's the sort of like urban fantasy historical fiction stuff, we're not really expecting there to be like ancient forerunner beings and magic items and whatever in our very serious historical game. But to me, speaking as a purely outside perspective, it always struck me that Assassin's Creed was kind of trying to have its cake and eat it too. Of like, we're a very serious, very realistic historical game. Now strap on this wrist knife and parkour. So,
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to that, and we'll get to some useful counterexamples of how games can put you into this scenario of you are a protagonist in an action game, yet we are trying to make that jive with real-world history. And, some games take settings as inspiration. And, Grand Theft Auto 5 it's Los Angeles in everything but name, but it's Los Santos, so they can play around with it. But when these games say, we're going to actually put you in, like, 1190s Damascus, like, the choice to actually set these games in these worlds, in these years, and have you interacting with these real historical characters has a lot of weight behind it and a correspondingly much higher bar to clear. So it is interesting to see the progression that we are about to witness over the course of over 10 years of game design. And I've played the games, all of them except for AC Valhalla, which I quit partway through. And I've watched a whole bunch of GDC talks, the Game Developers Conference, to prep me for this.
I'm excited.
I brought receipts.
Yeah. When we first met, one of the first things I learned about you was that you were like big into Assassin's Creed. So I'm gonna.
Oh, huge.
It has been like sort of an odd, somewhat mournful experience watching the experience of you and how your opinion of this franchise has sort of shifted, because I think when we met, AC2 was the hot new thing. Like,
oh, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Like it was on Game of the Year list. It was like, I was riding so high. It was one of the greatest franchises ever.
So that was my first impression, like fresh-faced first day of high school, this new kid, and it's like, wow, he's really into Assassin's Creed. That's neat. I don't know anything about it. And now just like, as the perpetual outsider, seeing it go from like, yeah, well, the graphics are kind of funky, but like, it's doing some interesting stuff, to like, oh god. So
we'll get to the oh god.
Yeah.
So I have titled this presentation "Tactical Anachronism," and we'll see what I mean in a second. But let's get into answer the question of how historical is this game series really?
Yes.
But like we talked about, the reason we're talking about this is because Assassin's Creed is what got me interested in history at all in the first place. Going into Assassin's Creed 1, Assassin's Creed 2, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Red, when you would have known me, was when Brotherhood came out, and it was like, oh my god, this is so fun, it's cool, and all these characters, look at this great, and it's like, oh yeah, Venice, that's where it came from. And it's just, you're running around in a world, and when I was studying history in high school, and it was like, oh, there's like George Washington crossed the Delaware River in 1770 snore and whatever, it's like, no, but when you are the hood man stab guy with knives for wrists. That's cool as hell. And the Renaissance becomes a lot more interesting when you're able to play around in that world. So there's a reason these games are special. You get to hang out with Leonardo da Vinci and see these people actually existing, not as like, that old drawing of Leonardo from his notebooks, but like as a young man talking about how he doesn't just want to paint, he wants to go out and invent things and change the world. That's so cool to actually be in that setting and see these characters as they're turning into the figures that we know them as, and seeing them have their character arcs turning into legends, which makes the secondary characters so exciting because, like, sure, the protagonist is the protagonist, but all of these secondary characters have books and books and books written about them. And that baggage, that context makes it so much more engaging because there's a lot that the player is bringing in with whether it's casual knowledge or, in some cases, much more robust knowledge of topics that makes seeing all these characters a lot more interesting. It's like the feeling of when, a Marvel character crosses over into a different Marvel property and it's like, oh, that's the guy, but like all of the characters are like that, so it's great.
It does seem to me, though, that specific appeal becomes a double-edged sword very quickly, because that means they have to be hitting the key accuracy points to get that. It's like, Spider-Man showing up in a property is only exciting if he does Spider-Man things, and you're like, oh my god, that's Pete! I know that guy! He's so funny and quippy and cool! And if you remove any of those key factors, then you lose the crossover appeal. You lose that sort of like nerdy, like, oh my god, I know what that is! Because if they get it wrong, then you don't get that factor of recognition. So I think we can kind of already see in this Greek tragedy we're about to witness unfolding the seeds planted of our hero's fatal flaw. Their very accuracy.
It's like if you go to watch a Marvel show and it's like, hey, yo, it's me, Spider-Man. Let's go shoot the Green Goblin.
With my
that's
spider
what happens
gun.
When you do it wrong.
Yeah.
So again, you get things like Machiavelli, who is just such a cool, badass guy with his like fun like cloak thing, and like he says cool things and he calls Ezio a dumbass, and it's fun. It's like, oh, that's great. Yeah. Seeing these characters, really, really in their element is very exciting. I remember there's one line where Ezio's like, talk to Machiavelli, and Machiavelli's like, I intend to write a book about you one day, Ezio. And Ezio's like, if you do, make it short. And I was like, Dad, is Machiavelli famous for writing a book? He's like, yes. Yes, he is. And I was like, so we have all this stuff, but the question is it accurate? That's the first thing a lot of people ask. Like, oh, Gladiator. Oh, well, is it accurate? And it's like, depends, because accuracy is kind of an all or nothing assessment. It's are the events exactly as they happened? Are the characters exactly as they're supposed to be? Are the aesthetics right? Is the vibe correct? Are all of these things accurate or not accurate? And it doesn't really leave a lot of nuance. It doesn't really leave a lot of opportunity for kind of ambiguity or getting the spirit of the thing rather than, letter of the law. So accuracy is usually the first question that people jump to, and for valid reason, but it doesn't actually end up capturing the real heart of the question, because at a fundamental level, this is a video game about a guy who goes to stab people and picks up artifacts from ancient precursor civilizations. It's starting from a kind of false premise, so it's automatically inaccurate because of its virtue of being a video game. So it doesn't really end up helping us. But a better question is it authentic? Which is a much more flexible metric, which allows us to capture the spirit of the history and be like, oh, is it true to what this setting was about, rather than, sort of a rubric laundry list of who, what, where, when. And this allows for a slight hiccup of where audience expectations of what something in history is like might not align with the reality of what that thing is like.
Yeah.
And authenticity allows you to bridge those two gaps, where if you're going for strict perfect accuracy, you might have to choose one or the other. But with authenticity, you can kind of play to an audience expectation without having to go, full one way or the other. So it lets you be a little loosey-goosey. Events can happen out of order. Characters can be, massaged to appear in the right places at the right times and kind of smush chess pieces around to get it for the sake of the story, and allows you to actually construct a more meaningful narrative where it's like, oh, these two characters are going to meet in the story, but in real life they were 2 towns apart and didn't actually ever talk to each other. So you can do things like that while keeping authenticity, so long as everything is internally consistent. You can play around with it a little more while still fitting that vibe. So
right. So it seems to me like the question of accuracy is kind of hobbled right out the gate from the fact that this is essentially historical fiction by its very definition, and it is the specific flavor of historical fiction that is secret world urban fantasy, where the gist is that to the layman, the world appears as it did in the real world and actual history, but secretly behind the scenes there was this, 2 different like ancient orders of conspiracy stuff and ancient tech and I don't know, aliens or something, whatever.
Kind of.
Okay, yeah. It's always kind of with the ancient aliens thing. But the gist is that to someone who is not in the know, the world appears as it was. And it seems like Assassin's Creed does not quite go for that, which is fair. That is by far the hardest way to do historical fiction. And in most cases, when people do like historical fiction, urban fantasy, they'll take touch points from real history and reframe them to have secretly been tied in with the secret world. Like the number of different secret world, the number of different secret world organizations that George Washington has supposedly belonged to is like all of them. It's all of them. If you have vampires, he was a vampire, stuff like that.
Exactly.
And those wooden teeth were too suspicious otherwise. But you know what I mean? Like, so it ends up being this complicated space where you never quite. Almost nobody who writes historical fiction actually produces it so that without these secret additional components, the story plays out exactly as it did in real life, for the primary reason that we do not have the ability to know exactly how things played out in real life to the minutest detail. We can't recreate them in fiction as a result. Yeah. So instead, it seems like the pursuit of authenticity rather than accuracy is more about producing the correct general impression, like like a first order approximation of what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things of a famous rule that the Assassin's Creed team had early on was the 30-second Wikipedia rule, which is so long as we cannot disprove something within, 30 seconds of a cursory Google search, it's good.
Oh my god!
So does this character die in 1478? No, they die in 1503. Okay, cool. Then we can't mess that up. But
that's such
if we get into like
metric.
real nitty gritty details, we can play around a little bit more. But like the skeleton of the history has to be intact, and within that there's room to play. So that was one of their guiding principles early on, and they eventually kind of threw out that rule as time progressed.
I wish people used that rule when commenting on our videos. They were like, I can't get this wrong in 30 seconds on Wikipedia, so it's fine. You're fine. Have fun. Here's a biscuit.
Just completely absolve us of our responsibility. The thing is, they took it upon themselves to set the standard of, we're actually going to try and like keep this as accurate as possible, but then they projected that picture of we are really striving for authenticity here. And then the disconnect between what they are saying their game is and what their game actually is becomes trouble. So as we're moving through here, other useful words, simply just to continue the discussion, are realism and grounded. It hits the same general vibe. Synonyms exist. I'll still focus on authenticity because it's just the word that we established. But there are other words to describe the same concept. That's why my realism reviews for Assassin's Creed Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla are titled realism review, not accuracy assessments.
Everything so wrong with. Anyway,
exactly.
Yeah.
But also. Just as a general rule, beware people using realism to justify discrimination in media. That is bad faith, and people who do that are assholes.
In general, any realism complaint that boils down to, I don't believe that this kind of person with this personality historically existed before X year in the 90s, is wrong and bad and probably hasn't talked to very many people. Because they tend to have a very flattened and reductive view of how the world looked back in olden history times, and it usually involves everybody being a very simple, easily boxed in stereotype, and doesn't account for the fact that there have always been wild cards, and there have always been people who don't take social norms for an answer, and there have always been those people from all over the world, and the world has never been as historically boxed in and rigidly delineated as it maybe appears to be in highly simplified explorations of top-down historical summaries, like
exactly.
Nobody ever stayed within the country borders that we draw on the maps as they are and never interacted with anybody outside of that. Or if nothing else, that was certainly not the universal experience. So if someone looks at something and is like, I don't believe there was ever a single black person in Rome, it's like, all right, you're stupid. Anyway, we're like, I don't believe there was ever a major woman who wasn't a whore or a queen. And it's like, cool. All right.
Anyway, so just a general disclaimer of like, watch out for people who do this because they suck.
Yep.
But with our ground terminology established, accuracy, authenticity, yeah. Let's get into it. So when Assassin's Creed first came out in 2007, it was a pretty big deal because if you can actually remember a time when open world game was a novelty and a selling point rather than, oh great, another one, this series was one of the real defining entries into the early canon of what an open world is and could be and what it meant to create a real, living, feeling space in a game world. 2007 was when most games were linear or first-person shooters, and this type of design was really new. So the thought of not only making an open world, but making an open world specifically to fit into an understanding of what the Middle Ages and the Crusades were like was an insane undertaking, and it's crazy that this game ever came about at all, because Ubisoft's previous historically inspired game, Prince of Persia, was a very linear game. It was very, very narrowly defined in what your character could do and where they went, and it was fundamentally a fantasy setting. It wasn't really grounded in reality. There was magic all around, and it was very kind of storybooky and fantastical, which is cool, but it's a very different beast from what they were trying to do with this.
Yeah, wasn't the framing sequence of Prince of Persia that it was the main character retelling it? So, like, whenever he fell down a spike pit and died, he'd be like, wait, that didn't happen. Hold on.
Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, let me start again.
Yeah,
exactly.
He got a little too into the yes-anding and wrote himself into a corner.
And then I died. Wait.
Hold on. Yes, but I lived. Sorry, go
Don't
ahead.
worry, I got better. I mean, really, the thing with Assassin's Creed 1 is to consider that open world games were something revolutionary at the time, and it seems so ridiculous to say that now because open world games are currently defined by unimaginative design, but at the time this was very new, very different, and very, very cool. Because even though the first game was not reviewed spectacularly, the concept of what the game could be was so captivating. And that's really what stuck with a lot of people.
Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong. Assassin's Creed 1 had a linear story in it, right? Like, there was a plot?
Loosely branching, but I mean, it had a defined story, but it was loosely branching. You could do some things in different orders, but it was the same core plot points no matter what.
I suppose it was kind of the first of the Skyrim and the Breath of the Wild alikes of like, it's an open world that you can explore, but there are a few beats you're going to need to hit in a linear order to do the main plot.
It was definitely more linear than your Skyrims or your Zeldas, your Breath of the Wilds at least.
Yes.
But it was still pretty wide that there's one section where it's like, okay, I need you to kill one target in Damascus, one target in Acre, and one target in Jerusalem.
Oh.
Take your pick. Go whichever one you want to go first. And that was cool. That was a really new piece of design that you didn't really see a lot of. So
well,
it definitely did give you
Jerusalem
freedom.
pretty
Not
annoying,
that much freedom because again, like 2007 versus 2011, 2017 Breath of the Wild, different, but still an early indication of that kind of design when it was still new and fresh and exciting.
Yeah. All right, cool. That makes sense. But that sounds like the big thing that completely set this game apart was the historical setting, the open world, and the exploration of the city. Like everything else was something they'd seen before, but this was a new level. Presumably, it was a very impressive stretching of the technological limitations they had at the time.
Completely. Yeah. Early PS3, Xbox 360 generation of games. It was really, really a step up from what you could do on a PS2 with crowd size, city size, draw distance, playable map area. They were really taking advantage of the new technology in a now uncharacteristic of Ubisoft revolutionary way. Overall, in terms of the world design, the craziest thing was to recreate an entire medieval setting basically from scratch.
A lot of domes in that picture.
This is Damascus. Or no, sorry, this is Jerusalem. Got confused. One of the cool things they did was they differentiated which city was which with color palettes. So Jerusalem is kind of greenish, Acre is blue, Damascus is kind of a tan gold color to help kind of keep each city feeling unique. but they didn't really have a lot of stuff to go off of because all of these cities look radically different today than they did back then.
Right.
So they didn't really have city maps. They had some landmarks, but it required reinventing a lot of buildings that no longer exist. So for instance, this picture here is of the Umayyad Grand Mosque in Damascus, and it was destroyed in like 1398 or something. So this game, taking place before then, had to take it upon itself to redesign this building based off of whatever sources they could find. And I don't know what specific sources they would have been working on for this, but actually going through the process of rebuilding things that no longer exist was, from the historical community, was really, really cool because in gameplay it's like, oh yeah, this is a building, it's part of the world, but the historians are like, oh my gosh, they remade this thing that doesn't exist anymore, and now it's a part of an explorable space. That was really, really neat.
Yeah, well, this is kind of reminding me of a much more recent instance of a technological innovation like that, and that was Interstellar, when they rendered the black hole, and basically they took all the equations that physicists had been playing with for decades at that point, and they plugged them into a really, really powerful visual renderer for the first time, and they were like, hey, we're getting this weird effect where, like, it's got this halo, and the physicists were like, oh, that makes sense. I've mentioned this anecdote before, but basically it was that they just never had the option to just plug this into a powerful 3D renderer and see what happens. And it feels like this is a similar level of excitement. Like the people, the historians who'd been studying this space, they would have known the maps, they would have known, the drawings of the buildings they had available, the reproduction, stuff like that. It's not the same thing as being able to load up a 3D rendered city and walk around in it and climb on the outside of this building that hasn't existed for 700 years. And I could see that alone just
it's crazy cool.
blindsiding them. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So one weird thing they did, kind of on the opposite side of that, is there is a church in Acre that completely is invented. They made up a church called the Cathedral of the Holy Cross that they put in for the sake of having a fully Gothic, super medievally looking church in the distinctly European city, because Jerusalem was controlled by Saladin, Damascus was controlled by Saladin, Jerusalem had changed hands a couple times, but Acre was fully Christian, fully European for pretty much the entire run. And to make this city feel more, French, English, European flavored, they put in fully Gothic architecture, essentially 60 years ahead of schedule. The earliest whispers of what Gothic architecture would be had been happening in France slightly earlier in the 1100s, but it wouldn't even come to widespread prominence in France for another century. And Gothic architecture never actually made it as far as the Holy Land, because by the time it had made it that far east, the Crusaders were kicked out of the Holy Land. So you get it as far as Cyprus, but Gothic architecture never made it to this part of the world. So this inclusion is purely here for the medieval aesthetic, just to serve that fantasy. And it doesn't super break the simulation, but it's a sign of things to come, where the aesthetic and the visual is kind of put over the authenticity for I recognize this is not authentic, but we're going to put it in because it looks cool. And in this instance, it's mostly harmless, but we'll see that thought process kind of crop up a little bit again in the future.
Yeah, I guess my obvious question is, does this location serve a specific gameplay purpose? Is it where...
Not really.
Really?
It's just for a viewpoint. It's really just there. So... There's no assassination mission that's associated with this church. You can't go inside it. It's just to have a big old Gothic church there.
So it's not like that's the tallest point on the map in that area, and they need.
It is the tallest point on the map.
Okay,
it is the tallest point on the map.
It does seem to me that a game that puts this much focus on climbing and parkouring, it would benefit to have a tall viewpoint in that spot in the map. It does seem a little odd that they would just invent a whole ass cathedral out of nothing in an otherwise fully historical city, but I don't know. I mean,
it's weird.
I feel like we're running into a slight hiccup here, because our definition of authenticity is by definition somewhat loose, because of course accuracy, that's rigid, that's clear. We can draw hard lines around what is and isn't accurate. Authentic, especially as a matter of historical aesthetic, it's it's by definition wibbly because on some level
Yep.
it's determined by the audience. Like I, plebeian that I am, fairly unversed in the ways of history, I see nothing wrong with this picture. You know, I have to be told like that doesn't make any sense there. You know, that's a whole 60 years out of date. And I'm like, oh, 60 years for a thing that happened 900 years ago. That makes sense. But like, you know, I'd look at that and be like, oh yeah, big cathedral. Let's climb up it and then jump off of it.
And that is why it's mostly harmless here, because it is, even though it's wrong, it is plausible. It's like, oh yeah, that's medieval European flavor.
Yeah.
Cool. It is wrong, but it doesn't end up being that harmful to the overall feeling, the immersion, the fantasy. Like, for instance, an actual medieval Crusader church would have looked something like this. This is a church in Jerusalem. It was the St. Anne's Church. That was one of their bigger churches, and it's certainly large, but it's pretty simple. It's got a smooth stone face, but not a lot of ornamentation. It doesn't have flying buttresses. It doesn't have giant spires. It's a cathedral, but it's not full fancy Gothic. So they could have put in something like this because this is period accurate, location accurate, but that doesn't really have the same kind of jazz to it. So you can see why they would have kind of taken one extra flourish and said, okay, we can put in cathedrals, but what if we just kind of like leaned in and stretched it a little bit for the sake of the look? So that's kind of where they push the farthest in these games to get some of that stuff, and we'll see it again later. So it's at this point, it's like it's a question: is this a valid choice? And you can make the arguments both ways, but at this point, it's not too bad. It's not too bad.
I'm reminded of a conversation we just had, I think, on the podcast that went up this week, which was about how in our early videos we would sometimes sacrifice accuracy to make jokes, and we've since adjusted that. We no longer sacrifice accuracy. We add jokes. We try and make sure that our retellings are as accurate as possible so people don't get confused. And it seems to me that this early Assassin's Creed game is almost suffering from the same issue, because it's clearly not setting out to be educational. It's not like, that's right, a fully accurate recreation of the city of Acre or whatever. It's not trying to do that, but it is sort of unintentionally filling that. I mean, our purpose of our videos has always been to entertain and to make education fun, which does in some ways mean not necessarily being as 100% accurate and comprehensive as we could be, because the point is to not be boring.
Exactly.
But in this case, they were also setting out to entertain. They were making a silly game about a guy who stabbed people. Like that's good, clean fun. But they're starting to sort of encroach on this territory they're clearly not quite ready for, which is full-blown historical accuracy. And like when we realized we were actually being, used in classrooms for some ungodly reason, we were like, oh, we probably need to dial back the swearing and like make sure that we actually know what we're talking about just a little, just enough.
Pressure's on. Pressure becomes on.
The pressure becomes on, and it seems like what they did by being the first people to just fully recreate, as best they could, a medieval city, they end up sort of putting themselves in a space where they must be held to a higher standard of accuracy, because even if they're not setting out to be educational, they are unintentionally being educational.
And even a lot of that pressure was put on them by themselves when they said, look, we're making this historically, minded game, this historically set thing, that they didn't have to do that, but since they did,
they didn't just stumble into it.
Since they leaned on that, they sort of put the pressure on themselves. So as we'll see, they continue this trend in Assassin's Creed 2, where they went wild with the joy and whimsicality and fun of this Renaissance Italian setting. So here is a picture of concept art from AC2, where this is just pure atmosphere. It's the canals, the gondolas, the carnivals, these masks, these fancy silk clothes, all this fun drapery, a big cathedral in the distance. This is just like pure joy, wonderment, excitement at this setting.
The joys of Vembis.
Big Vembis, exactly. And with later periods in time, taller buildings, bigger set pieces, and a much richer, denser urban playground for the players. So the setting being more rich and complex ends up reinforcing the game design, which is super, super cool. And since there is a lot more stuff to draw on, many more buildings from this period survived than from the Holy Land and the Crusades, there's a lot more that they can do to build up the world into this believable space, and there's a lot less stuff that they themselves need to invent. However, they do make some weird choices. This, for instance, is a comparison between a building in the game, Palazzo della Seta, and the Ca d'Oro, the Golden House. The one on the left is inspired by the one on the right. I think for legal reasons, they weren't allowed to use the one on the right because sometimes historical monuments are actually protected under copyright laws. There's a whole thing about it. We'll double back to when we get to Notre Dame.
Okay.
But they essentially invent an entire palazzo for the purpose of the game, which is fine. That's totally fine. Buildings came up and went down, but it made me look like an idiot when I asked when I was in sophomore year of high school, first time I went to Italy, and I asked my tour guide, "Where's Palazzo della Seta?" And she's like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
Oh, bud, yeah. Thanks, Assassin's Creed. Thanks for the core memory.
But exactly. But what's cool about this is that this building, Palazzo della Seta, is in the map of Venice where the Ca d'Oro would be. It's in the right place. It's clearly meant to be like, okay, fun, fancy design inspired by the real thing. So that's like, okay, they made up a building, but it's kind of like a GTA scenario. Like, this isn't one-to-one, but it's clearly on the same wavelength. This is fine.
Yeah,
this is fine.
This is the Vinewood sign of Assassin's Creed 2.
Exactly. It's the Vinewood sign. But what really impresses me about the setting of this game is that they show an impressive amount of restraint in what they do and don't include. So, for instance, this is the Bridge of Sighs. It is not in the game because it wasn't built until 1603. The game takes place in late 1400s, Renaissance. This was built a lot later after, if you watch my Doge's Palace video, a whole bunch of fires in that building. They kept on adding the stuff later. And this piece of very neoclassical styled architecture came later, so they don't put it in. It's one of the most recognizable sites in Venice that people want to go to, and they had the restraint to not put it in. That's impressive.
Yeah. That takes some serious restraint on the designer's part, because that they were like, we're gonna get some sternly worded emails about this one.
Yeah. And they could have, but they didn't, and that's a really impressive choice. Similarly, the Rialto Bridge, which is another very famous piece of architecture and a monument in the city, in the game is made of wood because at this point in time, it was made of wood. It wasn't redone in this full stone style until the late 1500s. I think, late 1500s, because it like burns down or whatever in the mid 1500s. But so in the game, in the 1400s, it's still very, very cool. It looks fun, but it's just wood. In the top left is a painting of what it would have looked like, and the bottom left is the game. On the right is what it looks like now. This is, again, remarkable restraint. They could have just phoned it in and designed it as it looked to make it as recognizable as possible, but they didn't.
It does look like cool. They fancied it up a smidge for the game. Like it's a slightly less linear shape.
They gave it a little bit more of that shape to kind of fit that roundedness. And that was definitely a choice to kind of imply the shape of what the bridge would later look like, but for the most part, this is essentially as close to a one-to-one to the original version of it as they could have done, and that's really cool.
Yeah.
But one thing that they do choose to do is they fast forward some parts of the city by about a century. So St. Mark's Square, right in front of all the big the Doge's Palace, the big St. Mark's Church, is fast forwarded by a century to give it the look that it would have had in the sort of neoclassical period when it had been converted in the 1500s. Even though by the time of AC2, late 1400s, it was still a very medieval style public square. So the philosophy that they're kind of doing here is, if it existed in the 1400s, we're going to show it in its final form. But if it didn't exist in this point in time, we're going to hold off. So it kind of works. They strike a little bit of a balance. They present St. Mark's Square in its most familiar version, and it's still kind of small. It's got gallows in the middle of it. It still kind of has some of its medieval character, but they just kind of imply what it would have looked like later. So there are some famous buildings. There's a very neoclassical styled library that was built in the 1500s. That's not there. But they do just kind of gussy up what the square would have looked like to give it some of that feel, because this is one of the most popular tourist squares in the world, probably. So there is a degree to which they have to present some of that imagined and anticipated look to the audience, and they still keep it authentic, but there is a degree to which they're meeting the audience halfway on this specifically, because it's so like fundamental to people's picture of Venice. So there's a bit of a give and take, but it still flies. It's still overall authentic to a 1400s historical Venice, but they kind of figure out like where they can stretch it a little bit. And this again is really good design overall.
Yeah, this seems, I'd say, less egregious than just putting a whole new building that is not at all in the right architectural style. Like, this might not have happened for another few decades, but it was still gonna happen.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a refinement of that strategy with the Church in Acre that gives people what they expect, but a little bit more carefully. And this same exact design philosophy also applies to Florence. Many of the same things happen. There are buildings on the left, Santa Croce, on the right, San Lorenzo, that existed certainly in the 1400s. They were built a ways before then, but they are shown in their final forms. So Santa Croce has a beautiful marble facade that was added in the 1800s. They just kind of show it on here because, you know, without it, the church is not very remarkable.
Right,
this is pretty much like the defining feature of it is this fancy facade. On the right, San Lorenzo, you can see it doesn't actually have a facade. It's just exposed brick on the front. If you go there today, the facade is not finished. There's a historical reason for that, but that's not why we're here. But if you look in the back, there is a dome on top that was added later in the 1500s with the help of Michelangelo and some other architects, specifically by the Medici family when they were the dukes and later grand dukes of Florence and Tuscany. So this building kind of plays a little bit loose with the history by adding in a full wing of the building that did not exist until the next century. But since it's only a century and it's a feature of that same building, San Lorenzo, it's a little more okay. It stretches it more than probably anything else in AC2, but it's still fine. Yeah. It's still pretty much fine.
I guess what this kind of feels like to me is like if you are an artist and you are drawing a figure in motion, most of the time the pose you draw the figure in is not a pose that person would ever technically take in the process of doing the action they're doing. You know, their facial expression will be different because you're trying to communicate the entirety of their movement in one still frame. So you don't just pick a single still frame. Like if someone's jogging and you like take a video of that and then you pause it, half of them will just look like they're standing awkwardly or like falling gently over. Like you won't get that sort of dynamism of action unless you get a really, really perfectly timed frame and the person's running in an unusual way. This feels kind of like the building version of that. It's like
basically,
this is not a photo of this is not what the building ever actually looked like, but this is like a montage, what's the word? A collage.
Composite.
That's the word. A composite, a collage of the components of the building that communicate most strongly the overall vibe of the building in the same way that when you draw somebody running, you don't take a still frame from the video and trace over it. So this does seem like it's somewhat sacrificing authenticity, but at the same time, it's sort of doing it to create a more overall authentic image of what the building was over a stretch of time rather than in a specific date in history.
Yeah. The dome on the right is a little bit of a stretch, but for the most part, this is like, this is perfectly serviceable. It's the same principle. If it exists, you can kind of fast forward to show it in its final form. Because again, this is still like, this dome was only built in the 1500s. It's not that far. It's still, within one human lifetime of when this game is taking place.
Right.
The facade on the left, it came later, but yeah. The Vasari corridor is a century early. It was built in the 1500s. That's fine. It's a very iconic piece of Ponte Vecchio. It's chill.
We're not mad.
One thing that people actually call out as being wrong are the towers scattered throughout the city. But up until the end of the 1200s, Florence was like many other Italian cities in that rich aristocratic families built kind of tower fortresses inside the cities because square footage was tough to come by, and if you wanted to build a big house inside this, walled city that already had a predetermined, sizing that you can't really expand out of it because then it's outside the walls and you're screwed, you built up. So skyscrapers, 5 stories or fewer, were actually rather common in Italy. There's one place in this game, San Gimignano, that still has a bunch of towers, but in Florence, there were many of these kinds of towers until the 1200s, when they would have been taken down after some city ordinance changed, what was allowed to be built. So these towers seem very out of place, but they are actually reflective of a true version of Florentine architecture, which is kind of wild, but is fun.
Yeah, that is cool. And also, they must have known when they were designing it, like, oh man, we need tall things for the character to climb. I've got it.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't in the room, but I would imagine there was a similar thought process. But again, it's valid because they're pulling on something that is attested, that is true and authentic to the history. But instead of being a little bit later, it's a little bit earlier, which is less common. But it's still the same design principle. Yeah. So it's neat. But the biggest structure in Florence is, of course, the Duomo, the big cathedral with the giant dome. And the weird thing about the way that this church appears in the game is that the facade is shown partially finished. It's under construction. So like Santa Croce, the facade was finished in the 1800s after Italian unification, but the church is half built in this point. What's interesting about this is that, Red, to your point, they're showing the motion. None of this stuff on the facade would have been done at the time of the game, but they're kind of showing it as an in-progress thing to give the viewers kind of a preview of what it would look like, so they can say, oh yeah, no, I recognize that, but it's showing it in progress as sort of a composite. So it's an interesting choice, and we'll double back to this fairly shortly. But one thing to consider is how important setting choice is for worlds design, because the more original structures are either, recorded or, better yet, intact, the fewer choices that the developers have to make, the fewer things they have to make up or pull out from out of their asses, and the more they can just play to what's actually there. So it's like the work is being done for them, and there's less choices they have to make because it's usually easier to just follow along with what already exists. So setting choice is important because the more extant of a setting you can pick, the easier it is to create an authentic world, because a lot of that stuff is there for you to just work with. Because if you're picking weird settings where there's not a lot of documentation, you kind of have to make stuff up, and then that doesn't end up being great. And we'll see where that takes us later.
Oh boy.
So one game forward, AC Brotherhood takes us to Rome, same time period, 1500 to like 1503, and the defining setting is spooky ancient stuff, because Rome was a city with a lot of ruins in it. It was very much a city in flux with a lot of layers. There's a lot of spooky kind of theming of like weird working in the shadows, and all these ancient buildings, and the organization of the church and the corrupt papacy and all this stuff. So it's very much a somber, spooky kind of game that ends up pulling a lot of early excavation for famous Roman ruins by having them dug up and ready for the player to run around on centuries ahead of time. So again, in Florence, some buildings were finished in the 1800s. In Rome, a lot of ruins were excavated in the late Enlightenment era and early 1900s. There's some fascism reasons for that, but we're not going to discuss that here. So even though a lot of Roman ruins would have been buried by the time of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, the Roman Forum was basically a cow field. They're pretty solidly excavated in-game for the sake of gameplay, because they're fun to play around on, but also to kind of surface the layers of Roman history and show off these ancient vibes that differentiates a setting like Rome from a setting like Florence and Venice, which are very much like, in their prime, fireworks, all this stuff, yay, amazing. Rome is like, it's been around for a lot longer. It's a much more tired city because it's had so much crap happen to it over the years. So this is in service of the old and spooky vibe. It is kind of exoticist, but not enough to cause big problems here.
I mean, like, Rome, I think you're allowed to exotify because it was kind of like, what's up? We're the center of all civilization and everyone important lives here. So you're allowed to be like, ooh, take a picture, honey.
Exactly. There's a grandeur and a mystery to it that these ancient ruins very much serve to to show off and kind of provide that aesthetic. But on the other side of that, looking a little bit ahead, the Vatican district of the city, way off in the corner, you don't spend a lot of time there for story reasons, but it is, a part of the game world that's explorable, is pretty much fully Baroque and neoclassical in its architecture, which ends up looking forward by about a century or so to after the events of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, after the big sack of Rome in 1527, to the rebuilt version of the city. And this is neat because when you go to Rome today, there's a lot of neoclassical looking stuff, Baroque, fancy architecture, all the, flying domes and things and crazy cool things, which wouldn't have really been authentic to 1400s, early 1500s Rome. But since it is such a vivid part of the city's aesthetic, they take that and they cordon it off into one little corner of the map to show that this is where the power of the city is. Rome was governed by the popes, and the power is really with the Borgia family up in the Vatican, so they show that power by giving this corner of the map this extra grandeur, this extra kind of forward look by fast forwarding it about 100 years. And that's cool. They're playing with theming and the implication of monumental fancy architecture to reinforce the ideas and the story, which is cool, while then also serving as a window into this neoclassical look that Rome today is very much known for. But since it isn't authentic to the rest of the city, they kind of put it off in one spot and have it as this little pocket of neoclassicism, so that it's still there and those layers of history are still there for the player to experience and enjoy, but it's not spoiling the authenticity by just, slapping neoclassical buildings on, 200 years before they're supposed to be there. So this is clever. This is actually a really clever choice.
Yeah, it seems to me like physically separating it out from the rest of the game helps sort of mentally subdivide it so that, even because again, you've got your audience members like me who would not notice that anything was wrong. You just be like, oh, neat, this building's different looking, if I got that far. But anyone who does know would be like, oh, see, they kind of put it off in this corner and they're using it to accentuate the plot reasons why they're wanting to highlight this power imbalance. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So like it doesn't bother people like me, and it sort of undercuts the bothering of people who actually know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And one of the things that they do really cleverly is that there are two different versions of St. Peter's that they could have gone with. One is the one on the left that was very medieval, it had been around for a while, and the one that we recognize, the one on the right, was built over the course of the 1500s, finished in 1615, but that wouldn't have been around at the time of the game, so what do? It's like, this is a really famous piece of Roman architecture. How are we going to include it? Can we even include it? So what they do is genius. They take the medieval front, the layout, the facade, and the courtyard from the medieval version, and then kind of superimpose the modern dome on top of it, but they show the dome as being under construction. So all of the foundations of this very, very famous building are presented at the level that the player will interact with, kind of, on ground level, in its very medieval form, but in the skyline at a distance, because you can't actually climb up on St. Peter's the way that the game world is laid out. There is one mission where you run around on the scaffolding, but it's a narrowly defined linear set piece. But over with, at skyline level, you see this big dome, but it's under construction. So you get to see that sort of like peek ahead of what it's gonna look like, but they show it under construction to show like, look, it's not done yet. Give it another century, which is a very clever way to sort of balance, like, we want to show you this thing that's a little bit ahead of time, but we don't want to, pretend that it's completely done now. And this is what they did with the Duomo facade in Assassin's Creed 2, where they show you this look, this peek at what it's going to be, but they put the scaffolding on as like, but it's not there yet. It's not there yet. And this is really clever.
Yeah, it's a good visual language to basically be like, okay, that's not what it would have actually looked like, but it's fine, they'd have gotten there eventually.
Yeah. So again, and like you said with the running pose, this version of St. Peter's with medieval layout, medieval facade, medieval courtyard, and the neoclassical dome on top absolutely never existed. Nothing like it. They tore down the whole thing before they replaced it. But it's a clever way to keep both, because the most recognizable aspect of St. Peter's is the dome. But what they show for most of the player on ground level is the medieval version. So they keep that authenticity there while still allowing that indulgence of the future shape of the dome. So it's subtle, But I think it is quite genius, and it allows the developers to show the layers of history and that strata between ancient, medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque. And it's clever. It is fundamentally the strategic, tactical anachronism at the heart of AC's world design that allows them to play around while still maintaining that fundamental authenticity. And I think it works spectacularly well, and there's a reason that these games really took off so much with the medieval and Renaissance crowds, is because they did such a good job of showing these worlds as, cultures in flux.
But the fact that we have a few hundred years of, hindsight sort of flattening it all behind us is like, well, it's all history. There was different layers of it, but ultimately it's all history. Like, Assassin's Creed, it won't show the Roman ruins in their full pristine marble prime, but it will show them excavated when they weren't, and it won't show the super future neoclassical stuff in its super polished, just been built prime, but it will show it under construction as sort of visual shorthand for being like, look, at the time of the game, this hasn't happened yet, and this is really old. So, we'll show it stuck in the ground, but, unburied so you can see it and play around in it, and we'll show this. So again, it's never at any point recreating an actual historical environment as it would have been. But I do think they are sort of, playing to the audience they have. They know that most people playing these games would not be super intimately familiar with the layout. And, I actually remember a game that came out that kind of lost us because it didn't do that. And it was the first Watch Dogs game. Because it was advertised as being like, it's Chicago, you can run around Chicago. And we're both quite familiar with the layout of Chicago, and that was not Chicago. That was about 1/4 of Chicago.
It was the downtown, like, north of the river and a little south of the river, and everything else was like, what are you doing? But
it was
that downtown was
bizarre.
good, but everything else was so weird that it just broke the illusion immediately. Whereas
they
with
just needed to get in the Sears Tower. Yeah.
Exactly. But with this, it's cool because they basically create a bell curve where, like the peak of the bell curve is centered on whatever year the game takes place in, but there's like kind of a century and a half on either end, which ends up serving the game very, very well. So so it works. That is the tactical anachronism at the heart of the design. And this becomes the go-to strategy for historical realism for the rest of the series for the next several years. So it is a familiar anchor point, but it keeps the world believable. So for instance, in Assassin's Creed Revelation, Hagia Sophia, just taken over by the Ottomans like 50 years earlier, it only would have had one minaret at this point, and it wouldn't have had all this extra buttressing that was added in the 1500s by later Ottoman architects, but they show it in its final form because that's what we recognize. That's fine. Again, AC Black Flag, in Havana, there is basically one famous cathedral in Havana that was built in 1777. The game takes place in the 17 teens during the Golden Age of piracy. If they didn't have this church, there would be nothing in Havana that is even mildly recognizable. So they're like, look, it's half a century. Who the hell cares? We're going to put in the church. It's the one big set piece. That's fine. They just fast forwarded a century. It's still completely authentic to the world they're creating. It's half a century off. It's within the bell curve. That's fine. Totally valid. Notre Dame is an interesting example because it's a very composite picture of different versions of Notre Dame. They have a lot of medieval stuff, a lot of earlier stuff from like 1700s that would have been destroyed at the time of the French Revolution. But what they put in is that metal spire that we all know and recognize and miss, RIP, which wasn't added until the 1800s. So they're creating a composite image of Notre Dame, which has a lot of medieval character to it and a lot of 1800s kind of post-Enlightenment romantic era character to it. And it fits together very cohesively in a way that all of us recognize because, like, without the spire, Notre Dame's not Notre Dame. We learned that the hard way. So they take an approach that puts a lot of little puzzle pieces together to kind of smush all of those layers. Instead of Rome in AC Brotherhood, which really shows you the different layers, this Notre Dame puts it into one cohesive thing that's just like, here it is. Here's all of it in one vista. And this is perfect. This
also,
is
they're
great
not the
design.
Only people who did that, because they did that in Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. The spire's there. Quasimodo climbs it. And, that's definitely not accurate for when it's supposedly set. It's
set in, like 1500s or something.
I guess.
But, I don't remember specifically. But, exactly. And this is great design. It works so well. There is a reason that this game was so evocative and so praised for the way that they reconstruct this church, because it is not a version of Notre Dame that ever existed, yet it's the platonic ideal of what we think of when we think of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Absolutely genius. Spectacular. Skipping forward a little bit, Assassin's Creed Odyssey breaks authenticity in one way and reinforces it in another, and there's a lot of controversy around the way that they did that. The big thing is that Sparta had no navy in the Peloponnesian War, and the fact that Sparta and Athens are shown as being able to, have a pitched, possibly even fight on land or at sea is ridiculous. The idea that there is a conquest system where you can go around and if you want to paint Greece red and have everything be Spartan, you can do that. That's nonsense. The reason the Peloponnesian War lasted 30 years is because it was a Cold War where no one could get a leg up on the other. Athens could not face Sparta in a land battle. Sparta could not face Athens in a naval battle. So everyone stuck to their strengths, and they had no way to fight each other.
They're just going, no, man, you swing first for 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that there is actually this active, heated conflict with battles springing up everywhere that the player can influence by, being in the right place to fight this battle and claim this territory for Athens or Sparta, that is nonsense. It is fundamentally antithetical to what kind of conflict the Peloponnesian War was. It's a very, World War II kind of framing of it's a war, you give and take. There's battles all the time. It's no, there were 5 big battles in the whole Peloponnesian War, and 3 of them were sieges. So in this regard, it's very inauthentic to the history of Peloponnesian Greece that they're trying to show. But the way that they show the myths is actually really, really cool because they present ancient Greece in the way that the Greeks would have understood it, where, oh, what's under the labyrinth of the palace of Knossos? The Minotaur. Oh, where's the Caledonian boar that Hercules slayed? It's in Caledon. All the things are in the places where they culturally would have been understood to be. So this is a world where gods mingle in human affairs. Monsters walk the earth. Legendary animals are around, mysterious hills. It's a very realistic, ironically, depiction of how the Greeks understood their world, even if we know these monsters didn't exist.
Yeah.
It reflects the version of Greece that the Greeks thought they inhabited, and that's really, really cool. So in that regard, even though it's not necessarily realistic, it's very authentic to Greek mythology, and that's super cool.
Yeah, and that's just a very fun thing that a lot of adaptations do when they'll take ancient Greece. They'll add the myths in sort of as a layer.
Yeah.
Actually, this happens with a lot of folklore. There's a lot of there's anime set in feudal Japan where they're there's just demons and yokai around. Well, why not? It's where'd they go in the present? What do you mean? Yeah,
exactly. And remember how we said that that setting was critical? Well, they made a very bad choice later on, because in the earlier games, all of these settings were narrowed in on one specific moment. Italian Renaissance, Golden Age of Piracy, French Revolution, Cleopatra's Egypt. These are all very vivid, evocative time points that they're all, really clear eras that can exist within a few decades and have a very distinct visual identity.
Right.
But when Ubisoft went for Vikings, they had a historical movement that spans literally half of Europe and lasted for over 3 entire centuries. So the question was, where and when would they set this? And when the announcement came out, I was actually tweeting about this, and I went to great lengths to surface this tweet from 2020 where I say, ideally, the later it's set and the larger the range, the more interesting the world will be. But what they ended up doing was setting the game very early in Viking history and confining it, at least at first, pretty specifically to England, being the great heathen army of the 860s, which is also the exact setting of the TV show Vikings, where they could have gone anywhere else. And they end up kind of boxing themselves into a corner. One effect of this is that they end up doing a very terrible job of handling pagan religions by exoticizing it, showing it as evil and spooky Celtic people with deer antlers hanging around in the woods, despite the fact that almost all of the Celtic pagans would have converted to Christianity at this point, centuries beforehand.
There's a reason we don't got no documentation.
Yeah, St. Patrick is fully 3 centuries before the events of this game. And it's annoying because they put it in because it's spooky and it looks cool, but it is outright dishonest and fully inauthentic. It's just lying to the player for the sake of putting in something cool. They do this with Celtic mythology. They do this with Norse mythology. It's very exoticized. It's super icky. and they end up leaning into some really, really dangerous visual language for how they
yeah.
portray the Vikings. So they're all tattooed, they've got undercuts, they're wearing tons of furs, and this really doesn't have a basis in Scandinavian archaeology or written records. The tattoos appear in one source, and they're probably not even talking about tattoos. And it uncritically plays into the aesthetics co-opted by fascism in the 1900s, as well as today. So this gets extra icky when paired with the hyper-masculinity and might makes right thematic, ideology at the core of this game. Like, oh, you show up to this land, you conquer this place, and it becomes yours. Great.
Yep.
When you put all those ingredients together, that is super yikes. And the game uncritically just throws all of this stuff in because it looks cool. They're not engaging with it. They're not thinking about what it means to be saying these things. They're just putting it in for the aesthetic of it. And that ends up being really dodgy when they're dealing with a look as historically abused as the Viking look has been.
I guess here's the problem that we're running into, which is that this is inauthentic in that it is inaccurate, but as previously mentioned, authenticity is by its very nature a loose definition that is on some level reliant on what the audience is expecting to see. So previous games would draw on things that were inaccurate but were authentic to an audience that knows the extensive history of a location. It's like, okay, this wouldn't be built for another couple hundred years, but it's so fundamentally part of the skyline, we're going to throw it in. It's like that is appealing to a specific audience. I'd say that this is a very, very bad choice, but it is appealing to a specific audience and that specific audience's vision of what an authentic Viking game would look like. Again, as mentioned, the actual historical Vikings, if we're going with the accuracy angle, had very little in common with this aesthetic. They were very well groomed. They were not particularly sexist. So you have just all this stuff where it's like, none of that is accurate. But if you did all of that, would you create a Viking game that people would recognize as Vikings? And I think what they did, and I'm not saying it was a good idea, I am in fact saying it was a very bad idea, what they did was tap into the Viking aesthetic for the same reasons they've tapped into all their previous aesthetics. They were like, we have to go with what's recognizable. We have to put this church in Havana because there's no other buildings anyone will recognize in Havana. We have to put St. Peter's Basilica. Is that a thing you mentioned?
Yes.
We have to put that in wherever city that was because otherwise, people will be like, where's the Basilica? I think the problem is Vikings are such a loaded concept ever since, Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. Ever since then, the Viking aesthetic has been so much stronger in people's minds than any actual historicity. And the historians that actually study, Vikings, they know the truth, but the aesthetic, it's very glamorous, it's very appealing. Even if you are not an actual fascist, the aesthetic of like a bunch of burly shouting warriors covered in furs and tattoos.
Powerful.
Yeah, it's powerful. There's something appealing about it. And you combine that with the narrative of like, these guys did kind of conquer most of the known world that one time. Like, it's similar to Rome. Vikings and Romans are the things that get co-opted by fascists because they did what fascists want to think they can do. It all turns into like they were a great big army of super strong turbo chads and they conquered the world. I've stolen that one from you. I love the phrasing so much.
Turbo as a prefix is so useful.
Giga chad is the other one that I love. But like it's an aesthetic that has been that appeals to a specific demographic of people that want to feel powerful, and thus the aesthetic becomes self-sustaining. It becomes a power fantasy for people who desperately want real power. And that turns into a rather toxic loop that ends up exacerbating all the completely inauthentic / ahistorical components of the aesthetic and ends up creating a new image that is accepted as authentic. And if you deviate from that, you have to do so much heavy lifting to explain to people why, no, this is actually accurate. So I guess the thing is, to me, it seems like phrasing this as inauthentic, I don't know if that's even correct, because the authentic Viking aesthetic hasn't been part of a pop cultural zeitgeist since, I don't know, the 1700s.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was, and what I said with the setting is like, there is no way, having chosen 800s, late 800s AD Vikings, there is no version of that where you can meet both an audience expectation and the historical, truth of the matter and bring those two together. They are so diverged that there's no way to make those two even slightly align. So what do? They go with expectation. They go with what looks cool. So they fundamentally chose to break with historicity for the sake of catering to that aesthetic, because the choice they made to do Vikings there was no other way they could have done it than by going down this path. So it was a losing battle from the start, and as I mentioned in the tweet, there was no way they could have made this work.
But like, we know why they did that. Everyone was doing Vikings. God of War did Vikings.
And unfortunately, Assassin's Creed Valhalla was the best-selling Assassin's Creed game, I think, ever in its first, however much time. So that, unfortunately, they learned the lesson that we didn't want them to learn. And one last thing here is, as far as world design goes, the stave churches are simply idiotic because they are using designs of 12th century Christian churches as Norse pagan temples.
What?
And not only is this 200 years out of date, but they're lying about what it is. They have you go to see these Norse pagan, shaman characters, whatever, and they're in these stave churches. It's like it's not just out of time. It's wrong. It's just lying.
Yeah. That's a very odd decision. That feels like it was made by two different people, They were like, for the map design, we need to make it look like this. And, look, I know we're 400 years off, but stave churches are a thing that people recognize and associate with it.
It is maximum aesthetic at the expense of anything approximating historicity or authenticity. And the game is set in the 860s because they wanted specifically to have the Viking invasion of England to be able to present Vikings at their absolute most Vikingist ever. But they pull in all kinds of stuff from centuries in either direction and juxtapose ancient Britannia with, idiotically giant Roman ruins, spooky Celtic pagans, and Arthurian legends, and smush that in with late medieval history, having 12th century Christian stave churches, late medieval weapons and armor, and whole-ass Norman castles that wouldn't have been built until the Normans show up, which is, introducing an entire civilization that was not even there at this point. And it is all in a giant English Viking history soup to look cool, but it's a mess, and there's no cohesion whatsoever. Even in the previous games where something was wrong, it was still cohesive, and this is completely incohesive. But even the mainline stuff that you'd see at surface level is 400 years either side of 800s, and it's just here to look cool, and it is so incomprehensible when you put it together that what it does is it creates what's called a Uchronia, which is a fictional time period ostensibly set in the real world. So in the TV show Archer, that's got 1960s to 1980s stuff, but it's never exactly clear when the show is set. That's a Uchronia. It means no time. It's the same root of Utopia. And Valhalla's setting is so just everywhere that it creates a Uchronia that is only vaguely centered on 800s Viking England, which is really unfortunate in the context of Ubisoft having had a literal written rule about exactly that in their brand commandments. When they started to get into transmedia, they needed to have it so that there were set rules of what you can do with the series. And rule number 10 is Assassin's Creed can bend historical accuracy but cannot create a Uchronia. And they literally did that for this game.
I love this phrase. Sucks. I'm going to be abusing it so much now that I know
Uchronia?
it. Yeah, I'd never heard it before.
It's super useful.
Yeah, it's I remember hearing about Gotham, back when that show was happening. It's is it set in the 60s? Then why does everyone have cell phones and laptops? What's going on? Why does everyone dress like that? But
that's Uchronia.
Wow, that's so useful.
It takes real world stuff and throws it together into a time period that is so soupy and inconclusive that you cannot actually put a year on it. But a good counterexample to this is how Ghost of Tsushima handles history. So we've talked about this a little bit on streams, and basically the whole point of this video is to distill, at this point, years of streams of me rambling, but not ever quite being able to get to the point of what I think about these things, and putting it all into one video, so it's here and then I can rest. But
lay down your arms.
Ghost of Tsushima is the Assassin's Creed Japan game that Ubisoft were far too cowardly to make, and it handles the history really well. Because it is set in the 1274 Mongol invasion and inspired by real history, but the weapons and armor are 300 years early. Actual samurai in the 1200s were mostly mounted archers. The concept of katanas didn't exist yet. A lot of the samurai armor was made later. And the characters are all made up. The main antagonist of Khotan Khan, totally not real. The aesthetics of this game are not based on actual 1200s Japan, but are specifically pulled from 1900s Kurosawa samurai cinema movies.
Yeah,
so really what this game is it is a very elaborate Akira Kurosawa film that is set in the Mongol invasion of 1274. So on paper, this is a Uchronia because it's got stuff as far back as 1200, it's got stuff in, late medieval, early modern Japan, and it's got stuff from the 1950s. But the reason that it works a lot better is because the overwhelming vibe is of that samurai cinema, which lets things fly a lot more than if the overwhelming vibe was 1200s history. Yeah. So the funny thing is that the actual Mongol attack on the island of Tsushima, it did happen, but it only lasted 4 days before the ships were blown back in a storm and the fleet was entirely scuttled. So what's happening here is not really a historical narrative, but a very elaborate what if. Because it's what if, the Mongols actually stayed? Because the game takes place over weeks and months as opposed to 4 days and the Mongols went home just as soon as they arrived. So since this is a what if, the disbelief is pre-suspended for you, and they're able to play a lot more fast and loose because it's already not, trying to be a specific historical recreation of anything specific. So since they are saying look, we're doing samurai cinema and we're setting it in the Mongol invasion, but it's not even really the real Mongol invasion. It's just a what if scenario. It can play a lot looser and still feel authentic to Japanese culture without having to feel authentic to 1274 Japan and the Mongol invasion.
Feels like the same stunt they kind of do with things like Wolfenstein. With this, it's look, the thing that we're basing the game on lasted 4 days and didn't play out like this, but if it did, here's how it could be. And it's also not framing itself as historical. When Ghost of Tsushima's first trailer came out, it was all about the aesthetic. It was, we all knew this was the result of a 72-hour Kurosawa movie bender. We knew.
Exactly. And a lot of the game is sort of, it plays on storytelling and stuff like that. There's the multiplayer mode is literally an in-universe storyteller explaining a version of what happened, where instead of just fighting some Mongols, there are all these demons that are around. So the game is already, even within its own narrative, it's playing with perceptions of storytelling and reality that makes it a lot easier to get invested in this world and still have it be authentic without even really trying to be strictly accurate to the specifics of this time period and not trying to lie to the audience and pretend that it is. So this is a really good counterexample because they know what they're doing and they set the bar at exactly where they're trying to meet it. They're not promising something that they're not actually going to do.
So do you think that Assassin's Creed had some kind of Assassin's Creed Shogun thing in the works and they quietly scuttled the whole thing when Ghost of Tsushima did? Okay, all right.
No, never. If they were going to do it, they would have done it by now.
I think we were creeping up on it. I think once they got their ancient Greece and Vikings, they were like, what else have we done? Japan. Everyone likes the Japans. And then it's oh, look at this. Ghost of Tsushima. It's doing what you did, but good, actually. And
that's the thing is, this game is far better than what an Assassin's Creed Japan game would have been. There is nothing Ubisoft could have done that would have touched this. So that's what I really like about this game is it's if Assassin's Creed was still good, it would have looked like this. And that's the thing is that, when this kind of design works, it works extremely well. When the AC games do the historicity and the authenticity right, it's spectacular because casual viewers can recognize these pieces of culture, recognize famous landmarks, famous figures, and feel like they're in a believable world. And trained observers and historians can, specifically appreciate, what they put in and the restraints to we're not including the Bridge of Sighs because it wasn't built until later. And everyone can kind of feel like there's something cool to be had in here. With the specific instance of the construction, the scaffolding on St. Peter's Basilica and stuff like that it's like an asterisk saying, we will put this in the game, but we're showing you that this world is in flux. We're showing you that there's strata and this isn't just a static picture. There is actually movement happening in this game world. So it's funny that this tactical anachronism works so well, it is almost carte blanche, and yet Ubisoft still managed to screw it up.
Yeah,
which is unfortunate.
That's what's interesting to me. Structurally, it feels like the way they planned out the later games doesn't feel so different from the way they handled the earlier games that it should be such a catastrophic failure. But I don't know. Can it really be as simple as just they didn't signal what layers of history they were drawing from, and they drew a little too strongly from the completely uneducated stereotypes rather than the actual factual historical stuff that they could have been using?
Because, we saw even from the very beginning with Assassin's Creed 1, they were still putting things in because they look cool. And what Assassin's Creed Valhalla represents is the culmination of that philosophy, where that becomes the guiding principle of, does it look cool? Put it in. And that overrides everything else, because that urge was always there, but it was kept in check through the other design principles that we've been talking about. But with the development of that game, the Viking aesthetic is so powerful that it just overrode everything else.
I guess it seems to me like Assassin's Creed has always been balancing, like you said, multiple different design aesthetics, and what's worked in the past is that each one was keeping any of the others from becoming deal breakers. Too much historicity and I think the game would have been boring. Too much aesthetic and the game would have just been practically indistinguishable from every other fantasy pseudo-historical game running around.
Persia.
Exactly, yeah. And then, so let's see, too much historicity, too much aesthetic, and then just too much focusing on one specific time frame really limits the ability to actually design the map. You're essentially just recreating, Google Street View 1275 or whatever.
Yep.
So they end up sort of being like, all right, we need it to have enough of an aesthetic that it's actually good and cohesive. So, we can add color grading to the cities, even though that's completely not accurate. And we need it to be historical enough that we're actually grounding in something real, because that's what gets people invested in an urban fantasy setting, is seeing the familiar through the lens of the unfamiliar. And we need it to be, dang it, I'm losing track of which three things I'm doing, but you know what I mean. It had these three things they needed to balance, and it seems like, especially for the Vikings, the problem they ran into is that the historicity and the aesthetic were at actual odds with each other.
Yeah, they're fundamentally incompatible, and that was the problem. They should have never chose that setting, but because they were so guided by the aesthetic, they're like, no, we'll just do it anyway, because it's cool. So it was the complete disintegration of every little ounce of restraint that they've ever had in designing these games all in one spot. And you saw it, even with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they still had a lot of really, really good stuff in there, but there was so much that they wanted to put in for the sake of you can change the course of the war, that they threw out everything about what makes the Peloponnesian War and turned it into just any other conflict.
Yeah, so, that basically turns it into Age of Mythology, red versus blue dots on the map. And
exactly. So at the end of the day, it's it's just a game. Blue, chill out. Why does this matter? And the thing is, since games are so visceral with you being able to participate in this world, they have the unique ability to truly make the past feel real and present and interactable, and they are such a powerful asset that when they work well, they're an untouchable, unequaled way to make history accessible for people, no matter who they are and what background they have, such as me when I first got into it. But if they're designed carelessly, because they are so powerful, they can reinforce misconceptions, stereotypes, or flat-out dangerous agendas. Video games as a medium are a tool, and sure, they are used primarily for entertainment, but if a game is going to step into this mantle of we're doing history games, there's a lot that comes with it. And if you want to set the bar lower, like Ghost of Tsushima did, where it's look, we're just, we're doing samurai cinema with a historical setting, that's great. But if you're gonna sell your game as a, historical, interactable world that's based on this real setting, you gotta follow through with it. And the story of Assassin's Creed is a tragedy of a brand that absolutely did not do that. Stacked on top of a tragedy of a developer that slowly got more and more toxic in its workplace, with more and more sexism, flat out racism too, and just horrible management with people in power abusing their positions of authority, to the detriment of not just their employees, but the products they make. There are all kinds of stories you can look into, and I won't spend the entire detailed diatribe talking about this, but there are reams of articles about the ways in which mismanagement of these teams and of these game franchises has not only made the games worse, but has destroyed entire dev teams in terms of morale. Several people who just felt unsafe at work, who quit, or worse. It's frustrating because, we want to love these games so much because they are such an enjoyable thing and they're so fun, but games are a serious business. It is the most lucrative entertainment medium in the world, more than movies, more than TV, more than music. It's a big deal. Games are so powerful that we have to take them seriously. They matter so much because they are so important and so present in so many people's lives. So it's not like, oh, it's just a game. It's the most interactive and impactful form of, engaging a person with a medium because it's interactive, because the player is the person who's exploring these worlds and meeting these characters. The standards and the bar is so high. That's why it's so important. It's not just a game. It's a game. That's why it matters.
I guess when you mentioned that, as an accessible entry point into history, there has to be a level of care taken to balance the entertainment factor with, basic human responsibility. I mentioned before, what we do for a living and what Assassin's Creed was designed to do is not fully dissimilar, and we have to take similar care, and if the point is to make education fun and accessible, we need to also make sure that it's not funneling people into bad systems of education and bad patterns of learning. And, we try very hard not to reinforce stereotypes. There are a lot of easy jokes we don't make because the easy jokes are based on, stereotypes and pre-existing structures and things that are not true and should not be reinforced. And, it would be easy, but we don't do it because it would be wrong. But also, we're tiny, and thank God for that. Like, the channel's already bigger than I ever thought it would be, and we're so tiny. Like, we know we're a niche, and that's good. That means that we can sort of mess around and create stuff for the audience that we have, rather than having to make something with all the corners sanded off that will not mislead people down these rabbit holes of just these cesspools of historical misinformation that we can just kind of meander around and go back to making silly jokes and having fun. But that's the problem. Assassin's Creed they accidentally, I'd say, completely changed the playing field, and then they just were not up to the task of taking on the responsibility they'd accidentally given themselves. Because that first one, it's like, it's historical, but they're having fun, It's like, oh, we've got a framing sequence that justifies why we're doing this in medieval whatever. It's fine. Everything's cool. And then after that, as they decided to lean into their one extremely strong selling point of, hey, we're doing historical stuff, they didn't really go all the way with that. They didn't double down on the accuracy and the historicity, which was, at that point, their primary selling point. Like all the stuff we've described. Yeah, all the stuff we've described, all the stuff they do to serve the aesthetic at the detriment of the historicity is like, yes, this isn't accurate, but it is kind of cool, so we're mostly okay with it. But I feel like that's almost the problem. Like, aesthetic may be what they should have been prioritizing over accuracy for the sake of entertainment value, but accuracy is what they were selling themselves on.
Yep.
And we've essentially reached the point where the divergence between those two paths has split so far that they're no longer in any way accurate, and they're still kind of trying to ride that wave of, but we're the historical video game franchise. We do historical stuff. And it's like, do you? When?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that we don't want to say like, oh, if you're not going to do it perfectly, don't try. Of course
God,
not.
no.
But
yeah.
The point
Us
is
of
that,
all people.
this is the tragedy of this is that they set themselves up and put themselves on this pedestal and advertise, look at how good we are at this, and then they're not, and that's really what sucks. So the reason I put this picture on the screen here of Alexandria is because Assassin's Creed Origins has one of the coolest worlds in any Assassin's Creed game. It's ancient Egypt in the time of Cleopatra, and it's got all this incredible stuff from Greece and Egypt and Rome. It's all mixed together, and it's this beautiful, vivid world. But then when you get to the character of Cleopatra, the first line out of her mouth is, I will sleep with anyone so long as I can kill them in the morning. So you've gone through all the effort to create this beautiful world, and then you butcher the main historical character at the heart of this entire civilization, who represents everything that Hellenistic Egypt was about. And you murdered her by making her a slut again.
What bugs me, Da Vinci, the way they did Da Vinci in those early games, like, they drew on stuff that isn't super well known about him. Like, he's not the version that, any, Johnny Rando like me would know about playing the game. He's not old. He hasn't done a lot of his famous artworks yet. They kind of play up the gay thing a little bit, which is not common knowledge. They had that option.
Very true, though.
Yeah, but they had that option for all of these characters that they looped in from their historical thing. They could have played up the lesser-known stuff. They could have played up, like, maybe the player character was surprised at Cleopatra because they had an image in their head of, like, what she was like, and then it's like, wow, she's just a really great conversationalist. I could get lost in her eyes. It's like, whoa, what's happening? You know, they could have done that, and instead they chose to break from this asset they had, that they could draw on lesser known but factually confirmed things about these people and put them in the game and increase that feeling of authenticity that way. Because if you just go into a game like this and get only what you expect, you know, it reinforces your preconceptions, but it doesn't immerse you to the same degree, you know? It's like you're immersing yourself in like room temperature water. It's like, well, no surprises in here. Yeah. But then you hit the little squeaky rubber ducky that is Da Vinci, and you're like, wow, what a vibrant character this is.
Exactly.
Oh, boy.
So that's really the thing, is there is a reason these games were so special, and it's a shame that they've let themselves go so far. And that's what sucks, because these games meant so much to me. They are the reason I got into history, and the reason I am able to do this job right now, because if I didn't have these, I might have still gotten into history, but it would have taken a lot longer, and I wouldn't have the same interests as I do, and I still, again, probably wouldn't be here if not for Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood in particular. So that's why it hurts me so much to go back to this and think, oh my god, it was so good, and then look now and think, oh my god, it's so bad. Like in Assassin's Creed 2, there are lines of dialogue that are quoted out of actual history books and accounts of conversations that happened. That's so cool.
That's very cool.
And yet they let themselves go. So it's just it's so compelling because it is so tragic, and it is so tragic because it was so compelling. So I can keep lamenting for hours and hours, but I think we've just about exhausted the analytical depths to which we can take this conversation.
I'd say so.
I don't know, Red, do you have any closing thoughts before we call it a day here?
Well, I think, you know, in the last several years, we've seen a lot of like beloved childhood franchises and things that inspired a lot of people sort of try and recapture the magic and fall flat because they don't seem aware of what it was that they did that was so inspiring in the first place. And, you know, like, Assassin's Creed is definitely one of those things, and I feel like it's easy to sort of mourn how those things fell apart, and, like, that the person who made it work in the first place, or the team that did it, just didn't seem able to keep it up, didn't know what they were aiming for, couldn't really hold it together. But you know, the reason why people care about those things so much is because they did it right once. You know, they did it right at some point. And I think there's always value in going back and seeing what was inspiring about what did that right in the first place. You know, it's like, it's become something of an internet pariah, but Game of Thrones must have been doing something right in those early seasons because it had everybody watching it. And, you know, early Star Wars does hold up. You know, the original trilogy does a lot right. It's very simple, but it's a simple meal well made. And, you know, Assassin's Creed, the first few games, they just knocked it out of the park. And then they kind of started extending out of their comfort zone and trying to do different things, and they couldn't really hold it together. But that doesn't undo the good that they did. It doesn't retroactively ruin the earlier parts that were solid. And I think it's easy to sort of mourn lost potential, but it's always worthwhile, I think, to go back and look at the things that actually did shape you and how they did that and why and what parts of them worked. I mean, you know, for you, Assassin's Creed sparked a lifelong interest in history. For me, it's that thing where they have the knives and the fun hoods. Like, it didn't resonate with me the same way. But there are other things that got me into the stuff that I'm into now that maybe didn't age super well or didn't grow in super helpful directions. But I still go back and, you know, revisit and immerse myself back in those things that shaped me because they affected me for a reason. And I don't know, I've seen some people kind of be like, oh, it's ruined forever now. It's like, no, it's not. The parts that you loved are still there. You know, they're still part of you. It's just, it would be nice if there was more of it, and it's sad that there isn't.
You have to grow alongside it and be able to understand it for what it is. Like, these games are still the games that had such an effect on you, but now you know that as time went on, the company got a lot worse at taking care of its employees and letting, you know, abusive managers do their thing. The game is really aggressive with monetization and super icky with how they're trying to put NFTs in games. And then you hear things like, as of last week, there's a rumor that the next Assassin's Creed game is going to take the character Basim from Assassin's Creed Valhalla, who's an assassin from the Levant, and it's going to be it's a smaller game set in the city of Baghdad, the great capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. there's not a super strong popular aesthetic associated with, the Abbasid Caliphate, but there's so much rich history that we can draw from. There's this chance, and I've been seeing this in people in the community, like, this could be good because they're actually kind of going for it again. Yet, this is still the same Ubisoft that's been doing all this other trash that we don't like. So it's like, how is it going to play out? And I don't know. And I'm like, I don't want to get my hopes up. I don't want to just write it off. But it ends up being very difficult. So we'll see. I'll put an addendum in the comments if next year I have more things to share. But otherwise, I think that's all we've got to discuss today. And I think we may have broken the record for longest detailed Diatribe. God damn it.
I, for one, am not surprised. Every time you're like, this one will be nice and bite-sized.
Yeah.
No. Well, this is an outlet for us to be as passionate as we want about something near and dear to our hearts that we've been mulling over for years. Of course it takes over an hour. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's about us covered. So,
bye.